G'day everyone, Ben the Spider Seeker here. Today I'll be going over another enclosure build, this time for Rosie, my Atrax robustus, the Sydney funnel web. She's about due for an upgrade, there's a few reasons why. The last one was for my Hadronychi vasuta, or Blue Mountains funnel web. There were a few lessons to be learned there. In terms of appearance, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and the magnetic viewing panel functions pretty well. But it could be improved to make the burrow a little bit darker. One major point though, is that there's not any webbing around the burrow I made. Instead she's decided to burrow in the exact opposite corner. There she is there. She's quite happy in that corner though, and is a very active eater, so I'll take into account the difference in burrow structure she's made in my new plans. This is the enclosure to be upgraded from, belonging to my female Atrax robustus, the Sydney funnel web. The webbing is looking a bit worn out and she's not maintaining it in the way I would expect. This usually means something is wrong, which we'll look into later. Before putting her in, the enclosure was quite neat and tidy, with some moss to liven it up a bit and provide some shelter for the springtails I used to clean the enclosure. Now though, her webbing has covered up most of the enclosure, though she has used the burrow I made for her, unlike the Blue Mountains funnel web. This could be a good sign that she'll use the one I provide her in the upgrade. The plan is fairly straightforward. Find a relatively cheap and therefore small fish tank. Then I'll carve the burrow out of Hebel brick, just like the last one, using the same method as well. But this time I'll be removing the excess bulk, allowing the moisture to absorb more from the substrate, rather than just relying on a sponge. I'll also add some rocks this time, to help the burrow feel a bit more sheltered. The reason I think the last one didn't use the burrow might have been because the entrance was a bit too open. I'll also add in some moss, and maybe a small plant to reflect the moist areas Sydney funnel webs are found in, rather than the more alpine areas of the Blue Mountains funnel web. Then I'll be modifying the cover design for the burrow, just to make it that little bit darker inside. I started looking around the paddock for some suitable rocks and found a lot of granite and quartz. They of course needed to be washed, so I soaked them overnight to scrub and rinse in the morning. The cheapest tank I found was 16 litres, and it came with a few pieces of equipment for keeping fish. While it's not particularly necessary, it was cheaper with it than without it, so I have it. I used an old butter knife to carve out some grooves in the Hebel for the rocks to sit in more naturally. The Hebel brick is a relatively soft material, so it's easy to carve, but it will blunten most abrasive tools, like rotary tools, pretty quick. That's why I usually just use the cheap old tools, and they tend to last pretty well too. I used the same carving method as I did previously, making use of the cheap masonry bit and a drill to carve out the bulk, then a wire brush and the butter knife to neaten up the rough edges. The result was a slightly larger than necessary burrow, which is good because I plan to put some substrate in there just to make the spider feel more at home. I then used an old wood saw just to remove the bulk of the excess brick, and the drill, wire brush and knife just to round off and neaten up the edges. Once I was happy with the shape, I used 100% silicone since it contains no toxins, just to hold the burrow in place. I made use of the bag of gravel that came with the tank as an effective brace while it dried overnight. While adding the substrate, I wanted to make sure it was moist all the way through, so I sprayed the tank down every now and then, just with water. It was also useful to get the peat off the glass at the edges too. I patted down the substrate, making it relatively dense, particularly around the burrow, just in case the silicone started to become a bit loose. Some of the keen-eyed people might spot a small catch cup off to one side. This contains a Scolopendra layetta. It's a type of centipede that varies quite a lot in its appearance. The one I found has some bright blue legs and a red head. I'd found it earlier that day, and it got a small temporary enclosure assembled for it as well. My goal with the substrate is to create a natural feeling gradient, a gentle rise from one end of the enclosure to the other. No sudden divots or steep sections like there were in the last enclosure I built like this. And that's because you usually find Sydney funnel webs under things. They don't generally burrow into a slope as such. I used the jet with the spray bottle just to clear the burrow entrance and knock a bit more substrate into the burrow, where the spider can use it to make the burrow a bit more comfortable. In placing the rocks, I really want to make the entrance feel as sheltered as possible. So I selected that rock first, and then built the rock arrangement from there. I rarely plan the layout of the surface beforehand, just have a rough idea and develop it as it comes. So I didn't have a set arrangement in my head, just went with what felt natural. I had a small fern too, just to make it feel a bit more like somewhere I'd find a Sydney funnel web. Next up, the substrate was feeling a bit bare, so I went for a walk and gathered up some moss from around the property. I made an effort to remove as much soil as I could in the hopes of minimising other invertebrate eggs hatching in there. I like to have some sort of plant material just for the springtails to live in. The springtails are incredibly small insects that break down organic material, including mould, so they're very handy to have in a moist enclosure. Again, I'm just trying to lay the moss out where it would seem to make sense naturally, rather than planning out what I'm doing. I'm also sure to water the areas before and after I put the moss in. And here's the end result. The burrow entrance just covered slightly by the rocks. The cover is just cut out of MDF. I shaped it as required just to provide full cover for the burrow, then softened the edges using the saw rasp. I also created a small divot as a handle just to be able to remove the cover. I made a second copy of the cover, that way I could make a bit of a frame to go underneath it, just to act as a buffer between the lid and the glass. In theory, reducing the impact against the glass and decreasing the light that can get through into the burrow. After getting the shape right for the second copy, I lined the two panels up just to drill the holes for the magnets later. This would make sure that ultimately when I get to using it, they line up fairly well. After I finished drilling the holes, I used a retractable knife to cut out the outline for the viewing panel. It took a while, but eventually came out with some smooth edges, which was good. Once I finished making the cover, I needed to paint it. I usually just use spray paint, and it needs a few days to dry properly. But I was pretty keen to get the spider out to see what was wrong with her, and to get her into a new, hopefully more comfortable enclosure. To remove the spider from the old enclosure, I just removed all of the material on top first, so all the decoration, old moss and web. I then tipped the enclosure on its side, making sure to keep her on top. I used a straw to scrape away at the dirt so as not to damage her fangs if she bit it. I had the enclosure in a tub with smooth walls as well. Since funnel webs aren't able to climb the smooth surfaces, I knew she at least couldn't escape from there. I just kept scraping away at the entrance to the burrow, slowly making it wider and more accessible. Sometimes if you're lucky while rehousing them, they'll just rush out of the burrow for you, seeing what you're doing as an attack and seek to defend. This can make it easy, but she chose instead to stay in a burrow, so I just kept scraping away. Once I'd cleared enough space to get her out, I used the straw just to poke in underneath her. She bit the straw a couple of times before running out of the enclosure, and it was at this point that I started to become a bit concerned for her health. When I first got her, as you can see here, her abdomen was a nice even colour and relatively symmetrical. Now though, it seems like the round enclosure she was in might have hidden a few of her features, because now it seems like there's a blister-like swelling on either side of her abdomen, and it's pretty obvious now. And it's also looking to be a bit swollen and misshapen, beyond where I would expect for her size even if she was gravid. A few possibilities sprung to mind. She might just be gravid, which would probably be the best case scenario, but it doesn't explain why she stopped maintaining her webbing in the old enclosure. The second possibility is a parasite, causing her abdomen to become bloated, which may indeed explain her behaviour. Another possibility is, well, something completely random and unlucky. It seems, in some cases, that female funnel webs just develop abnormalities in their abdomens, looking like blisters, and then unfortunately they die not long after. It could of course just be her. No matter what, I wanted her in a new, fresh enclosure where she can hopefully be a little more comfortable and give her a better chance at survival. I was sure to catch her as gently as possible for release into her new enclosure. I gently coaxed her into a catch cut with a straw, being careful not to cause her any unnecessary stress. She was pretty relaxed as far as funnel webs go, not rearing up at me or anything, just running into the jar for me. When releasing her, I gently placed her down directly in front of the burrow and guided her in with the straw. I then left her alone, with a temporary cardboard cover taped over the burrow, just while the paint dried on the other cover. Once the paint was dry on the MDF after a few days, I used a 2-part epoxy glue to glue the frame and magnets in place, keeping them temporarily in place with masking tape. This was done as quickly as possible to minimise the stress on the spider, and quickly covered back up afterwards to keep the burrow dark. With the burrow still covered, I was able to double check the polarity of the magnets through the cardboard, just to make sure I glued them into the cover the right way around. This was again using a 2-part epoxy, just to make sure they didn't come undone anytime soon. A day later I was able to remove the tape and place the cover. She has seemed to take up residence in the burrow, but will occasionally wander at night, and she hasn't webbed up yet, but I hold out hope she will recover. Unfortunately, the nature of wild-caught invertebrates means that sometimes you end up with a spider that has a problem. When she arrived, after ordering her, she suffered from a mite infestation. After treatment, she recovered well. Now it seems something new has hit her. I've done what I can to give Rosie, the Sydney funnelweb spider, a nice comfortable environment to live in, and I've rarely disturbed her by opening the cover since moving her into the new enclosure. I'll be sure to keep her well looked after in a low stress environment just to aid her in recovery. Either way, I'll provide an update as to the outcome. For now though, I've been Ben the Spider Seeker, and you've been great. Catch you next time.